On a July morning in 1706, they tied a woman's thumbs to her toes and threw her in a river to see if she was a witch. Grace Sherwood was her name. She floated when she should have sunk. And when they pulled her back into the boat, with the crowd screaming that it was proof, the sky that had dawned clear as glass opened up in a storm, drenched every last soul who'd come to watch. Grace had warned them before they pushed her. Before this day is through, you'll all get a worse ducking than I. Some nights up here on the porch, the air gets heavy with memory. When that happens, I sit with my coffee and think about the old stories my granddaddy used to tell. He'd say that places where simple folks live far from the big cities, working the land, depending on their neighbors. Those places hold secrets about how we treat people who are different. This here's a story about a woman who wore trousers when it was unthinkable, who planted herbs when it was suspicious, who made the mistake of never bowing her head. I'm going to tell you how a healer ended up bound and thrown in a river, how she survived the impossible, and how 300 years later we're still trying to understand what we did to her. If you like what you hear, go on and hit that subscribe button down below. There's always hot coffee and a story waiting for you here on the porch. Grace White was born in 1660 in a forgotten corner of colonial Virginia called Pungo. To understand what happened to her, you need to feel where she lived. Picture a place so isolated that getting to church meant 15 miles over poor trails. Mud in winter, dust in summer. Most families depended on flat-bottomed boats to navigate the creeks and inlets cutting through the region, because the roads simply weren't worth a damn. The White family's farm sat near Back Bay, an inlet that connected to Currituck Sound on the North Carolina border. Strangely enough, it was easier to sail to North Carolina than reach the populated parts of their own county by land. You lived surrounded by dense forest, giant trees, roots running deep as veins in the earth, vegetation that choked any clearing. The swamps teemed with mosquitoes carrying malaria. The suffocating summer heat killed newcomers before they'd been there a year. Virginia had 90,000 people in 1700, but over 120,000 had arrived since Jamestown was founded. Do the math. More than 30,000 died. The place was a meat grinder. When you got land in Virginia, you got virgin forest. You had to cut down trees, pull out stumps, burn what was left, then plow the ground stone by stone. A man could clear maybe 2 or 3 acres a year if he worked himself near to death. It was work that broke backs. Grace's father, John White, was a carpenter, a valuable trade where hardly anyone knew how to build proper. He'd received near about 200 acres in 1674, bringing his wife Susan and their eldest boy. The house he built was small, wood-framed, with a clay and timber chimney, 2 or 3 rooms where the whole family lived and worked. Inside they had a bed, table, chairs, trunks. It wasn't wealth, but it wasn't misery neither. They were above half the poor families who didn't even have chairs to sit on. Grace grew up working from dawn to dusk, like everyone on a small farm. But she had a gift most folks didn't develop. She watched plants, paid attention to the herbs growing wild along the swamp edges, learned which ones made tea that calmed fever, which could be crushed into paste for wounds, which eased pain. In a region where the nearest doctor was days away, having someone who understood herbs was power. Power to heal, but also power to be feared. In April 1680, Grace married James Sherwood. He was a common farmer, no land of his own, couldn't read nor write, no specialized skills. He wasn't exactly the best match for a respected carpenter's daughter, but John White seemed to like him well enough, called James my loving son-in-law in his will, gave the couple 50 acres when they married. Just 1 year later, in the spring of 1681, John White died, left the rest of the farm to the Sherwoods, 145 acres total. The will was witnessed by important men in the community, showing White was respected. John White's death was the beginning of the end for Grace. While he was alive, she had social protection. With him dead, she was just the wife of an illiterate man with no special skills. In 1701, James died too. Grace became a widow at 41 with 3 boys, John, James, and Richard, and 145 acres to work alone. She never remarried, worked the farm herself. Grace was tall for a woman of that time. Contemporary accounts say she was pretty, had a sense of humor, liked to laugh. But she had things that made her stand out dangerously. First, Grace wore her husband's trousers to work in the fields. More practical, made sense. But nobody else did it. Women wore dresses, always. Grace broke the rule. Second, she kept at her herbs, planting, harvesting, drying, preparing remedies. Medicinal herbs were specialist work. And there was a third detail. Men liked talking to Grace. She was funny, smart, interesting, knew about plants, about animals, told good stories. In a tiny community where boredom was constant, Grace drew attention. Some wives didn't care for that, and folks started telling strange stories about Grace Sherwood. Before the formal accusation started, there was already a story going around about Grace Sherwood. They said Grace had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in an eggshell. Yes, you heard that right. The story went that on a full moon night, Grace put an eggshell in the water, got inside it, magically shrunk or transformed. The versions varied, and sailed across the entire ocean to the Mediterranean shores, where she was enchanted by the rosemary plants growing there. Rosemary didn't grow naturally in Virginia. Had to be brought over. But according to legend, Grace brought cuttings back in that same eggshell, returned to Pungo in a single night, and planted them around her house. All the rosemary in Pungo had spread from there. The word they used to describe this feat was uncanny, supernatural, unsettling. And then they'd say, like it was obvious conclusion, clear proof that Grace Sherwood was a witch. The story didn't need to be true to have power. It just needed to be told. And once repeated, embellished, passed from mouth to mouth, Grace stopped being just the odd neighbor. She became the woman who could do impossible things. Early in 1697, a farmer named Richard Capps lost a bull. The animal just up and died. But Capps decided the blame lay with Grace Sherwood. He accused her of casting a spell on the beast. The records don't explain why. Maybe there'd been a dispute between them. Maybe Capps simply believed the eggshell stories, and when the bull died, he looked for an explanation that made sense in his worldview. The court asked, "Where's your proof?" Capps had none. The case was dismissed by agreement. But Grace didn't let it lie. She sued Capps right back for defamation. If he was calling her a witch publicly without proof, He was destroying her reputation. She lost. James had to pay court costs. In 1698, a neighbor named John Gisborne claimed Grace had bewitched his cotton crop and his pigs. Losing pigs or a harvest was real economic disaster. But again, no proof. Grace sued for defamation. Lost. James paid costs. The third accusation of 1698 became local legend. Elizabeth Barnes. Remember that name, because it's coming back in a way that'll turn your stomach. Swore to the court that Grace had transformed into a black cat. Entered her house, jumped on her bed, whipped her hard enough to leave marks, and escaped through the keyhole. Through the keyhole. Now, I've seen cats do some mighty impressive things in my time, but a keyhole, that's about the size of a coin. Even a cat can't fit through that, much less a grown woman who turned into a cat. But here's the thing. Doesn't matter if it makes sense. What matters is the story was officially recorded and added to the growing folklore about Grace. The woman who sailed in an eggshell now also turned into cats and passed through keyholes. Grace sued Barnes, lost. James paid costs. 3 accusations in 2 years, 3 lawsuits lost, and every time she fought back, she just dug the hole deeper. Grace had a neighbor named Elizabeth Hill. In 1705, the two of them got into it physically. Ugly fight, slapping, scratching, shoving, the kind that leaves marks and witnesses. Grace sued Hill and her husband for assault, and for the first time in years, she won. On December 7, 1705, the court ordered the Hills to pay 20 shillings in damages. Must have felt like victory. Finally, after losing 3 lawsuits, Grace had won. But by winning, she'd done the most dangerous thing possible. She'd publicly humiliated Elizabeth Hill. And humiliation demands revenge. 2 months later, January 1706, Elizabeth Hill and her husband accused Grace of witchcraft. The allegation, Grace had cast a spell causing a miscarriage. Elizabeth was grieving, angry, looking for someone to blame, and she'd just lost a humiliating public lawsuit to Grace. And who showed up to testify? Elizabeth Barnes, the black cat woman. Barnes wasn't just any witness. She was an experienced midwife, had delivered 60 babies in her life, lost only 3. When she testified, she said Hill's miscarriage was the most suspicious she'd ever seen, that there was something unnatural about it. During the hearings, Barnes claimed that whenever Grace looked at her, she felt intense headaches, like Grace was attacking her mentally. Suddenly, it wasn't just Hill saying Grace was a witch. It was Hill and Barnes, 2 respected witnesses. Grace was cornered. Before I tell you how the court handled Grace, you need to understand something fundamental. Virginia hated witchcraft cases. While Massachusetts had hanged 19 people in the Salem trials just 14 years earlier, Virginia had seen 19 cases over 80 years, and only 1 conviction. A man who got 10 lashes and was banished in 1656. No executions, no hangings. Why? For starters, the burden of proof was reversed. In Salem, the accused had to prove innocence. Imagine that trap. How do you prove you're not a witch? Impossible. But in Virginia, the court put the weight on the accuser. You're saying someone's a witch? Then prove it with concrete evidence. Beyond that, supernatural evidence was rejected. New England courts accepted dreams, visions, spectral afflictions, testimony that the accused spirit had appeared to someone and caused harm. Virginia threw all that out as inadmissible. They wanted physical proof, logic. Another crucial difference, the role of clergy. In Massachusetts, Puritan ministers led the witch hunts, preached about demons from the pulpit, actively participated in trials. In Virginia, clergy rarely showed up. Cases were judged by farmers and merchants serving as magistrates, practical men with plantations to run. And there's more. Social structure. New England's compact towns created intense community pressure. When hysteria started, it spread like wildfire, but Virginia was farms scattered across miles of forest. Didn't have that boiling cauldron of constant tension. Finally, Virginia's authorities saw witchcraft as an inconvenience, a distraction. They wanted to prosecute gossip, theft, tangible things. Witchcraft was divisive, complicated, rarely had solid evidence, so they discouraged these accusations, often let the accused sue back for defamation. But here's the problem. Princess Anne County in 1706 was poor, isolated, without educated elite to moderate tempers. And according to one historian, the county was obviously tired of Mrs. Sherwood. So, even reluctant, the magistrates decided to investigate thoroughly. In March 1706, the court tried to form 2 juries of women. The first should search Grace's house, looking for wax or clay figures, little dolls witches supposedly used to cast spells from a distance. The second should examine Grace's naked body, looking for devil's teats, marks where familiar spirits could suckle blood. The community women refused, simply wouldn't serve. Maybe from fear of retaliation. Maybe because they didn't believe Grace was a witch. Maybe because they didn't want to participate in publicly humiliating a neighbor. The court was stuck for weeks until they finally got a group of 12 together. On March 7, 1706, 12 women gathered to examine Grace. The court described them as ancient and knowing women, older, experienced, respected. They took Grace to a private place, made her remove all her clothes, examined every inch of her body, and they said they found 2 marks. The exact words, marks not like theirs, or like those of any other woman. They took what they called a witch's pin, basically a long, sharp needle, and stuck it in deep. Claimed it didn't bleed, that Grace didn't feel pain. Anyone who's ever had a wart or a thick callus knows those things can have reduced sensitivity, cannot bleed much when poked. But in that time, this was proof of demonic marking. But here's the detail that freezes the blood. The leader of that jury was Elizabeth Barnes, the same Barnes who'd accused Grace of turning into a black cat 7 years before. The same Barnes who was Elizabeth Hill's midwife and had testified about the suspicious miscarriage. The same Barnes who claimed to feel headaches whenever Grace looked at her. That was the person chosen to objectively examine Grace's body. Conflict of interest? Absolutely. But nobody in the court seemed to care. While the case went up and down between the local court in Williamsburg, which sent it back in April saying it was too vague, something happened during the hearings that wasn't officially recorded. But sources from the time mention it repeatedly. They asked Grace to recite the Lord's Prayer. It was a standard test. The theory was simple. A witch, being allied with the devil, couldn't speak sacred words, would either stumble or feel pain. Grace couldn't recite it. They also asked her to touch a Bible and swear her innocence. Sources say her hand burned when she touched the holy book, that she fainted trying to speak the words. I don't have official records confirming this. These details don't appear in surviving court documents. But multiple sources from the time talk about it, and the logic's inescapable. If Grace had simply recited the Lord's Prayer, the case likely would have been dismissed right there. But she couldn't. Why? Extreme nervousness making her forget the words? Never memorized it proper because she was illiterate? Deliberate refusal out of pride? Or, and I know this'll sound strange, did she truly believe she had some kind of power, and that's why she couldn't do it? Grace failed the most basic test that could have proved her innocence. On May 10, 1706, the justices issued an official statement. They admitted there was no particular act of maleficium, no specific proven act of evil magic against Grace. But there was, according to them, great cause of suspicion. Suspicion, not proof, not certainty, just suspicion. Based on that, they ordered Grace imprisoned. And on July 5th, the court made a decision without precedent in Virginia history. They ordered a trial by water, ducking. Europe had abandoned this method as superstitious decades before. But Virginia, desperate to resolve Grace's case, resurrected a practice from the past. It would work like this. Tie Grace with hands and feet crossed, throw her in the river. If she sank, she'd be innocent, and they'd rescue her. If she floated, she'd be guilty, because the water would reject someone marked by the devil. And here's something that breaks my heart. Grace signed a document formally consenting to the test. Why would she agree to this? Maybe from exhaustion after months of humiliating interrogations. Maybe she figured if she passed, she'd finally be free. Or maybe she realized she had no real choice. Refusing could be seen as confession. They set it for July 5th, but it rained. Heavy storm. The court postponed. The official reason, the weather might endanger her health. They worried about Grace catching a cold, but they were fixing to throw her bound into a river days later. They rescheduled for July 10th. July 10th, 1706 dawned with a sky clear as glass, not a cloud. Grace was taken from the jail to the church, placed on a wooden stool, told to ask forgiveness for witchcraft. Grace answered, "I be not a witch, I be a healer." Didn't ask forgiveness, reaffirmed who she was. They took her outside. They headed down a dirt road, today called Witch Duck Road, toward the Lynn Haven River. Word had spread. Hundreds came, maybe thousands, whole families, vendors. It was a spectacle. As Grace appeared, the crowd hollered, "Duck the witch!" At the riverbank, 5 women designated by the court took Grace to the water's edge, told her to remove all her clothes. The 5 examined Grace completely naked, searching for any hidden device, knife, wire, razor, anything she might use to free herself underwater. Found nothing. They covered her with a cloth sack to preserve modesty in front of hundreds of people, as if a thin sack made any difference when in minutes they'd be throwing her in a river where the wet fabric would cling to her body anyway. 2 boats were prepared. In the first, 6 of the justices who'd ordered the ducking. They rowed personally, didn't delegate, went themselves, respected magistrates, rowing alongside the boat, carrying Grace. They had investment in the outcome. Political, emotional, social, had to witness with their own eyes. In the second boat, the sheriff, a magistrate, and Grace. They rowed 200 yards out, nearly 200 meters. The crowd on shore could barely see details, but could see the silhouettes. The boat stopped. Dark water, calm, reflecting the perfect blue sky. Grace's hands were bound, right thumb to left big toe, left thumb to right big toe. X pattern binding. Impossible to swim or even keep balance. Before being pushed, she looked at the sky, at the 6 justices, at the sheriff, and said, "Before this day be through, you will all get a worse ducking than I." They pushed her. Grace fell in a fetal position, unable to stretch her limbs, should have sunk like a stone. But she floated, rose quick to the surface, bobbing sideways, fighting the ropes, spitting water. The crowd went wild, screaming, "Proof!" Which? The water rejected her. The sheriff, panicking, grabbed a Bible from the boat. Large volume, 13 pounds according to later records, and tied it around Grace's neck. This time, she sank. Stayed underwater 10 seconds, 15, 20, 25. Suddenly, she surfaced on her own, had untied herself. How? Maybe the rope loosened when wet. Maybe the knot was poor. Maybe Grace, in absolute desperation, used her teeth and nails. But she freed herself and floated again. They pulled her back. Right there, still in the boat, women examined her again and recorded finding more marks. 2 things like tits on her private parts of a black collar. 2 things like teats on her private parts, black colored. Think about this. In March, they'd found marks not like theirs, vague, generic. Now, after Grace failed the water test, suddenly more specific marks, more sinister. The evidence escalated as needed. They started rowing back, and the sky changed. Clouds appeared from nowhere, dark, heavy. Within minutes, the blue sky turned lead gray. Then it opened. Heavy storm, booming thunder, lightning, wind that bent the trees. The crowd was caught off guard, drenched everyone in seconds, clothes sticking to bodies. People ran for shelter. The 6 justices got soaked to the bone. The sheriff, the guards, everyone. And someone must have remembered what Grace had said. "You'll all get a worse ducking than I." Coincidence? Summer storms are common near water. But for people of that time, who'd just seen a woman float while bound, that was final proof. Grace had summoned the storm. They took her straight to jail, soaked, shaking, but alive. What happened next is one of the most frustrating mysteries in this whole story. The records were destroyed in a fire during the Revolutionary War. What survived? Grace was ordered to remain detained to be brought to a future trial. But there's no record of any trial. Some possibilities keep me up at night thinking, maybe it happened and the document was lost. Maybe the case went to the Superior Court in Williamsburg and those records were destroyed too. Or maybe, and this is most disturbing, there never was a formal trial, and Grace just stayed imprisoned without conviction, without sentence, without resolution. In September 1708, 2 years later, a bizarre order appears. Grace must pay 600 pounds of tobacco to a man. The reason isn't specified. Could be a fine, payment for prison keep, old debt. There's no record of payment. After that, silence for 6 years. Like Grace had disappeared, swallowed by the system. But in 1714, Grace paid back taxes on 145 acres in Pungo. She'd been released. We don't know when or how, but she had to fight to get the property back. The county had taken it while she was imprisoned. She managed to force the return with help from Virginia's lieutenant governor. Why would he get personally involved? We'll never know. And then Grace lived, worked the farm alone, planted her herbs, raised her boys. And here's something extraordinary. In the years that followed, Grace doesn't appear in any more court records. 0 problems, 0 accusations, 0 fights, 34 years of total silence. Did she learn to keep her head down? Or did the community finally leave her in peace? She lived until August 1740, about 80 years old, remarkable age for the time. When she died, she was a widow, left 5 shillings to each younger son and everything to the eldest. When Grace died, the stories didn't stop. They say the sons placed her body by the fireplace, and in the middle of the night a wind came down the chimney. The embers swirled. The body disappeared. Only a cloven hoof print left burned in the floor. They say black cats haunted the farm after, and men killed so many that in 1743 the county officially recorded a rat infestation. They say strange lights float over the river on July nights, right where Grace was thrown. Her house stood for 200 years. In the 20th century, vandals burned it repeatedly. Why? Lingering fear? Morbid fascination? By 2002, bulldozers tore down what remained, but Grace didn't disappear. In 1973, a historian wrote a children's book about her that brought the story back. A biographer worked tirelessly for recognition. In 2006, 300 years after the ducking, the governor signed an informal pardon acknowledging Grace was wrongfully convicted. The irony, technically, she was never formally convicted in surviving records. They erected a statue of her holding rosemary and accompanied by a raccoon. Every year they do reenactments. Whole streets bear her name. Grace became an inseparable part of the city. Grace's story was never about witchcraft. It was about what happens when someone doesn't fit in. Elizabeth Hill lost a baby and needed to blame someone. Elizabeth Barnes wanted revenge. And when several people decide you're the problem, you become the scapegoat. Grace floated because people float, basic physics. But she was caught in a trap with no way out. She survived, lived another 34 years, died at 80. And 300 years later, we're still telling her story. How do you treat the different folks in your life? Because all of us at some point will be the stranger. And we'll hope people are kinder than Grace's neighbors were. Her story ain't a warning about witches. It's a warning about ourselves, about how we treat those who dare to be different. Grace wore trousers, planted herbs, refused to apologize for something she didn't do. For that, they threw her in the river, but she floated and kept floating through the centuries. If you want to keep going on this journey, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me what you thought. Until next time, may nobody throw you in a river for being who you are.